Hello, I'm Erik Wait, and this is lesson number 9 in our study of the attributes of God. And in this lesson, we'll be considering the Omni Attributes of God. To say that God is omnipotent is to say that he can do anything that is consistent with his nature. God has power, that is, ability, to always execute his will. In other words, the power of God is only limited by his own perfections. Thus, omnipotence should not be viewed in the sense that God can do anything. There must be the additional qualification of his perfections and will. There are many who misunderstand this and attempt to portray God who can do anything and everything. The familiar sarcastic statement of, "Can God create a rock that is so heavy he can't lift it?" reveals a fundamental misconception of the omnipotence of God. In addition, it must be noted that God's power is in harmony by all his other perfections. It is not power run wild, but it is tempered by his wisdom, holiness, goodness, and other attributes. There is a definite relationship between each one of God's attributes with his other attributes. For example, since God is infinite, his power is also infinite, that is, without limitation or measure. Since God is eternal, his power has always existed in the past and will always exist in the future. That is, it is not acquired but inherent within himself. Likewise, since God is self-sufficient, he must be the source of all other power. Therefore, the power of God must also be greater than any other power. Finally, since God is self-sufficient, he possesses sufficient or adequate power within himself to accomplish whatever he desires, and is in no way dependent upon something outside of himself. Everything other than the person of God that exerts any kind of power is proportionately reduced, diminished, or depleted in the process and must be renewed. In contrast, the exertion of God in no way diminishes his power. The practical conclusions and personal implications of this truth is that nothing can ever be too difficult for God to accomplish, and no one thing is more difficult to accomplish than any other thing. A proper understanding of God's omnipotence should dramatically affect the daily life of the Christian, especially in their personal trust in God, their prayer life, and their witness to the unbeliever. The omnipresence of God. To say that God is omnipresent means that the person of God is everywhere present in the totality of his being. In other words, God is wholly present in every place. God is present everywhere, that is, at every location, including the believer's life, and since God is infinite, he must fill every space with himself. Otherwise, we can conceive of a God bigger than him. But just as space exceeds all that it contains, so God must exceed all space. In other words, God is not limited or bound by space. This understanding of God results in the doctrines of the transcendence of God, that is, being above and beyond space, and the immanence of God, present within space, and both are true at the same time. But we must always avoid the errors of panentheism, which says the universe is God's body, and pantheism, which says that God is the sum total of all that exists. In contrast to God, Satan is not omnipresent. He does work in the spiritual realm like God. He does have a host of helpers always available. He does work continually through the flesh of all mankind. He does work continually through this fallen world system, but he is in no way an omnipresent being, for he is not infinite. Is Jesus omnipresent? In other words, since Jesus is undiminished deity and perfect humanity united in one person forever, can he be physically in every place at the same time? Jesus in his divinity is omnipresent, and covenantally he exercises his presence through the third person of the Trinity, that is the Holy Spirit. John chapter 14, verses 16 to 18. However, in his humanity, he is not omnipresent, for he is still one person with two distinct natures, divine and human, which are not blended, mixed, or confused. Hence, Jesus as a man is locally in heaven, and yet spiritually he is present with us, especially when partaking of the Lord's Supper. To deny this, and to assert that Jesus' body is omnipresent, as do Roman Catholics and Lutherans, is to repeat the error of the monophysite heresy, or monophysite heresy, however you want to pronounce that. Although God is everywhere present in the totality of his being, he manifests himself to his creatures in various which are either limited or extended according to his sovereign choosing. Thus, God is present in the church in a different way than the world, that he is covenantally present. He will be present in heaven, manifesting his love and glory, and he will be present in hell, manifesting his righteous wrath. Contemplating the omnipresence of God can bring terror. No one can escape the divine gaze. But it can also bring comfort, for God is always present to help. Psalm 46:1. The omniscience of God. To say that God is omniscient means that he knows everything there is to know. That is, everything that can be known. All things actual and all things possible. In addition, he knows all things at the same time. That is, his knowledge is not successive but simultaneous, for his knowledge is infinite. Therefore, God has no need to learn something. He has never learned anything new, and in fact, he cannot learn anything at all. There was never a time, nor will there ever be a time, when God does not have this knowledge, for his knowledge is eternal. Consequently, God knows the end from the beginning, and his knowledge of what we call the future is just as complete as his knowledge of what we call the past. Furthermore, he knows no one thing better than another thing, for he knows all things equally well at all times, for his knowledge is complete. Thus, God is never taken by surprise or caught off guard, and he is never amazed at the events that has taken place in his creation. There's been much theological debate over the problems that develop as the omniscience of God is related to human freedom and personal choice. On the one hand, God's knowledge of future events and his determination to affect them in the course of history renders those events certain. On the other hand, God's knowledge of the future events, although rendered certain in the course of history, is not the cause of them coming to pass. Though God did foreordain whatsoever comes to pass, he is not the author of sin. Thus God knew that the fall would come to pass before he created, and in created he rendered the fall certain. Yet his knowledge of the fall and his choice to create are not the cause of Adam's sin. There are some, even Reformed and Presbyterian, who, because they take the supralapsarian view of God's decree, assert that God is the cause of Adam's sin, but he's not bound by his own law, and thus he remains faultless. And I just introduced a term, supralapsarian, the supralapsarian view of God's eternal decrees, and infralapsarian view of God's eternal decrees. I'll go more into that in a course on soteriology. While it might be difficult to reconcile and fully understand the issue of the freedom of man before the fall, the origin of sin, and how a morally good man could have an inclination to sin, and that a good God decreed that the fall would indeed happen, we ought to be content to view these difficulties as a mystery rather than fall into the error of accusing God of being the author of man's sin. Can God have limited omniscience and limited foreknowledge? There are some today who are advocating that God has limited his foreknowledge of future events. For example, Clark Pinnock states, decisions not made do not exist anywhere to be known even by God. They are potential, yet to be realized, but not yet actual. God can predict a great deal of what we will choose to do, but not all of it, because some of it remains hidden in the mystery of human freedom. God too faces possibilities in the future, and not only certainties. God too moves into a future not wholly known because it is not yet fixed. Those holding to this position do so because they think if God were to actually know every single thing about every single possible event, then they would happen because he ordained them, and that would eliminate human freedom. The real problem is neatly stated by one who sees things much more clearly. There is nothing significantly new about Pinnock's free will theism, but that this system is owing to the same impulses that are present in every generation to resist, however unwittingly, the absolute creator rights over his creature, and to make a place for human autonomy and self-determination through the limitation of God, either his power or his knowledge, or both. The church throughout history has never adopted the position of Pinnock and those like him. Stephen Charnock, in his classic work on the existence and attributes of God, wrote 92 pages on the omniscience of God, and he came to the following conclusion. God knows all future contingencies, that is, God knows all things that shall accidentally happen, or, as we say, by chance, and he knows all the free motions of men's wills that shall be to the end of the world. The Westminster Confession addresses this issue and establishes the biblical balance between the knowledge of God, his sovereignty, and the volition of his creatures. Westminster Confession of Faith, Chapter 3 of God's Eternal Decree. God, from all eternity, did by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will, freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass. Yet so, as thereby neither is God the author of sin, nor is violence offered to the will of the creatures, nor is the liberty or contingency of second causes taken away, but rather established, although God knows whatsoever can come to pass upon all supposed conditions. Yet has he not decreed anything because he foresaw it as future, or as that which would come to pass upon such conditions. Westminster Confession of Faith, Chapter 5, on Providence. God, the creator of all things, does uphold, direct, dispose, and govern all creatures, actions, and things, from the greatest even to the least, by his most wise and holy providence, according to the infallible knowledge and the free and immutable counsel of his own will, to the praise of the glory of his wisdom, power, justice, goodness, and mercy. Although in relation to the foreknowledge and decree of God, the first cause, all things come to pass immutably and infallibly, yet by the same providence he orders them to fall out according to the nature of second causes, either necessarily, freely, or contingently. God in his ordinary providence makes use of means, yet is free to work without, above, and against them at his pleasure. The almighty power, unsearchable wisdom, and infinite goodness of God so far manifest themselves in his providence that it extends itself even to the first fall and all other sins of angels and men, that are not by a bare permission, but such as has joined with it a most wise and powerful bounding, and otherwise ordering and governing of them in a manifold dispensation, to his own holy ends, yet so as the sinfulness thereof proceeds only from the creature and not from God, who, being most holy and righteous, neither is nor can be the author or approver of sin. Scripture teaches that God not only knows what is going to happen, but he knows it because he has determined from all eternity that it shall come to pass. Yet in doing so, he does not violate the creature's will, and he cannot be charged with the sinful actions of those who violate his revealed will. So there are serious implications in denying everything we just covered. Clark Pinnock, for example, because of his emphasis on human freedom and autonomy, he has to limit the attributes of God. He then follows this to its natural conclusion. If God is not going to interfere with the so-called free will of man, that is man's autonomy, then how could he have an infallible, inerrant word? Follows logically, and that is where he took it in the next step. And if God has not interfered with man's human freedom, and therefore hasn't provided an infallible, inerrant word, then how can you trust it? And if you cannot trust the word of God because it is not infallible and inerrant, therefore we do not know that it actually teaches us anything about God, anything about Jesus Christ. There is a trajectory of open theism, and John Frame wrote an excellent book in response to this, and I highly recommend it. What about Genesis chapter 22, verse 12? In Genesis chapter 22, we read that God told Abraham to offer his son, his only son, whom he loved, Isaac, as a sacrifice. As Abraham is about to slay his son, he is stopped. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Genesis 22, verses 11 to 12. So the question is, how can the text say, "Now I know," if God is omniscient, Didn't he already know that Abraham feared God? Well, there are three possible solutions to this question. First, this isn't God speaking, but an angel who isn't omniscient, who representing God as his messenger. The text says the angel of the Lord is speaking, not God himself, and the angel refers to God in the third person rather than, now I know that you fear me. The second option is that this is an anthropomorphism, God speaking as a man in time. This was John Calvin's view, as he wrote, "Truly, by condescending to the manner of men, God here says that he was moved by the experiment, is now made known to himself, and he speaks thus with us, not according to his own infinite wisdom, but according to our infirmity." Probably the most common answer in resolving this tension. How could God know all things and yet, and he says, now I know. But I think people often too quickly want to jump into what's an anthropomorphism. Anytime there's a challenge, God says that it's an anthropomorphism. I think we need to think it through a little bit more than just default to that as a possible solution. Now, up until this point, what I've considered to be the more likely solution was number one, which is this is an angel of the Lord speaking, and he says, now I know, not that now God knows. However, while editing this video, I came up with a third option. Most of the notes from these courses that I teach, I actually originally wrote in the 1990s. I rewrote them and edited them in the early 2000s when I was in seminary. And then over the years, when I've come across a book, when I've come across a quote or something like that, I've added to the notes. So the notes for a lot of my classes, they have been developed over 30 years, over in decades. So here is I think, third possible solution to this. I'm not completely convinced of it, but this is something, and I've never heard anybody else bring this up. This is just me thinking on this issue as a possible third way of resolving this problem, which is there are three aspects of knowledge. The first is the rational, that which can be known by reason apart from the empirical senses or personal experience. Second, the empirical, that which can be known through the senses. And third, the existential, that which can be known by being experientially. God, in his omniscience, knows whatsoever will come to pass in his mind, but his knowledge of Abraham's faith was confirmed empirically, having seen Abraham offer his son Isaac. Existentially, God would come to know things after the son added to himself a human nature. Then, via the communicatio idiomatum, that is the communication of the two natures of Christ, he would know things such as physical limitations, hunger, and pain. In a similar fashion, although God knew Abraham would believe and obey before the foundation of the world, for he foreordained it, there was another level of knowing in time, empirically, having seen Abraham offer up his son. So basically what I'm saying here is, when Christ took to himself an additional nature, a human nature, okay, he's still fully God and fully omniscient, but there were limitations of Christ during his earthly ministry when he's acting on his human nature. Okay, now that's far ahead of this time period of Genesis chapter 22. But in the communication of the two attributes of his divinity and his humanity, in the way in which they communicate, there's an aspect of the one person, Christ, who didn't know all things. So the concept behind that is God in time, obviously ultimately during the incarnation, during the earthly ministry, but when God interacts in time, there's an additional aspect of knowing, not just because he foreordained it, not just because he predestined it, but now he sees in time this coming about. Now he knows empirically, having seen Abraham obey, right? And this is why redemptive history is important, because he could have summed up everything in a second after the fall of Adam and brought everything to an end right then, right? But time is unrolling, unveiling. It's rolling along, and in God's redemptive plan, He's carrying out His decree. He's carrying out His decrees. So, did God know that Abraham was to offer up his son Isaac? Was He omniscient? Yes, He knew that. Is there an additional aspect of the knowing that is now empirically He knows? I think so. I think so. But I've never heard anybody else say this. I'm not gonna, you know, sink my reputation or my personal faith on this one. It's just a position I'm putting out there, and I'd be interested to think what others might think on that. Definitely, when we get into Christology, and there's a bit of a mystery as well. We can only know what has been revealed in the Scriptures, and so there's a bit of mystery. How God can be fully man and fully human. That is, Jesus Christ be fully God and fully human. There's about a mystery there, but there can also be a similar mystery in the way in which God interacts with the human race in time, in this sense. Alrighty, I know a lot there to think about. I hope you have enjoyed this lesson, and I want to thank you for following along, and I'm glad you're here. All right, until next time, may the Lord richly bless you.